The murder of Jeffrey Dahmer is actually a very interesting story. This is Christopher Scarver, the man that killed Jeffrey Dahmer and another inmate. Christopher himself was already in prison for murdering someone during a robbery. And on the morning of November 28, 1994, Christopher Scarver, while cleaning out the prison gymnasium with Jeffrey Dahmer, beat Jeffrey Dahmer and another prisoner named Jesse Anderson to death in the gymnasium area with an exercise bar. Now, it's interesting because people really don't know that much about Jesse Anderson, but he was also in prison serving a life sentence for murdering his wife. And initially, Jesse tried to blame the murder of his wife on two black men. But it was eventually discovered that Jesse himself was the one that murdered his own spouse. But this actually wasn't the first attempt on Jeffrey Dahmer's life. Earlier that year in 1994, Osvaldo DeRuthi tried to slash Jeffrey Dahmer's throat in the chapel after the church service that Sunday. Christopher Scarver claimed he killed Dahmer because he had unrepentant eyes and would make body parts out of his food. It was a shocking end to a shocking story.
This man survived an extremely brutal bear attack, and this is a massive trigger warning. In 2015, Chase Delwo was hunting with his brother in Montana when a worst nightmare situation happened. He came face to face with a male grizzly bear weighing up to 400 pounds. Chase only managed to walk backwards a few steps before the bear knocked him down and bit him directly on his head. After this, he bit Chase's leg and shook it around like a dog playing with a toy. The bear then tossed him in the air and continued to try and bite him. As the bear continued to attack him, Chase remembered a story that he read in a magazine once. And I quote, "I remembered an article that my grandmother gave me a long time ago that said large animals have bad gag reflexes. So I shoved my right arm down his throat." Crazy enough, after Chase did this, the bear left and Chase escaped what was almost definitely certain death. Chase's brother then drove him to a hospital where he received treatment for gashes he sustained during the attack. Thankfully, he didn't sustain any life-threatening injuries and went on to a full recovery. But as crazy as it is, if he didn't shove his arm down the bear's throat, he would most likely be dead right now. Luckily, when he did that, the bear just didn't bite off his arm. Thankfully, Chase survived, and this story is absolutely mind-blowing.
This murder victim got revenge on his killer from beyond the grave. It was the 10th of January 2021 in Kansas City, Missouri. 16-year-old Jason Ugwa was a remarkable student and a talented basketball player. He had a really bright future ahead of him, and his family were incredibly proud of everything he'd achieved so far. On the day in question, he was tragically shot and killed. His sister, 21-year-old Titiana Coppage, was understandably heartbroken. She posted a Facebook status stating, "I tried to shield y'all from everything I had to witness as a kid. I worked hard and long hours to keep a roof over your head. All I wanted was to see you happy, finish school and make it to the top. But somehow I still failed you." Now, although her brother's killing was unsolved, she had plans to get revenge on the killer. Rumours were circulating in the local community, and Titiana seemed convinced she knew who had killed her brother. Locals provided Titiana with the location of her brother's suspected murderer. Just 3 days after Jason's killing, there was another murder. CCTV captured Titiana driving from her house to a car park where police found 36-year-old Keith Lars gunned down. Titiana admitted to spotting Keith parked near Benton Boulevard, and she had shot him multiple times. Police searched her texts and found a message following the killing that she'd actually sent to her deceased brother. It stated, "Sent a blank to my brother, I owe him that body." The most up-to-date information I can find online is that she was being held on a $200,000 bail in 2021.
These are pictures with horrifying backstories, part 2. Mark Barden captured this image of his son Daniel on the morning of December 14th, 2012 while preparing him for school. Tragically, later that morning, Daniel, along with 19 classmates and 6 staff members from Sandy Hook Elementary School, fell victim to a wicked act of violence. Earlier that morning, 20-year-old Adam Lanza shot and killed his mother and then made his way to the elementary school to carry out the deranged act. Lanza shot himself before police arrived. On June 8, 2001, Mamoru Takuma entered an elementary school and killed 8 children with a knife, and 15 others were seriously injured. When asked for his motive, he said, "I've become disgusted with everything. I've tried to kill myself several times, but I couldn't. I wanted to be caught and be given a death sentence." Takuma was then convicted in August 2003 and executed on September 14, 2004. On June 11, 2021, commercial lobster diver Michael Peckard was swallowed by a humpback whale near Provincetown, Massachusetts. For over 30 seconds, his crewmates feared for his life, but fortunately, the whale resurfaced after about 40 seconds, spitting Michael out, and crazy enough, he survived with only bruising and a dislocated knee. This is just crazy, and imagine getting swallowed by a humpback whale. Next, this is the head of Portugal's first ever serial killer, Diego Alves. He murdered 70 people in the 19th century. His head was cut off, then preserved in a jar in 1841, and 182 years later, his head remains in that same jar on display at the University of Lisbon.
The Alphabet Murders are a series of unsolved child murders that happened from 1971 to 1973 in New York. And this case is really bizarre. So each of the victims of the Alphabet Murders' last names and first names started with the same letters. And they were all girls aged 10 or 11. Each girl was SA'd before they were killed and then was murdered by either manual or ligature strangulation. So the first victim was Carmen Colon. Witnesses on the night that she died saw her running from a car on the interstate. She was frantically waving her arms and had nothing on from the waist down. She was later found in a gully. And to this day, nobody knows who killed her. After this happened, though, these billboards were erected all over Rochester, New York, basically begging for anybody to come forward with information about what had happened. But nobody ever came forward. Then, about 2 years later, Wanda Walkowicz, an 11-year-old, disappeared and was murdered in the same way, followed by the murder of Michelle Mainza 7 months later, and once again she was killed in the exact same manner. There's only been really one composite sketch made of the suspected criminal behind these murders, and this is it. He was a white Caucasian male between the ages of 25 and 35 with dark hair, approximately 6 foot tall, and he was seen with one of the victims before she went missing and was found murdered. This rabbit hole goes really deep, and there are even people that are suspected to be the Alphabet murderer, and even other potential victims. So if you want me to talk more about this case, let me know and I'll make a part 2.
This woman accidentally got trapped in the back of a police car, and this is one of the worst deaths imaginable explained. This was 56-year-old Clara Paulina, and her husband was a longtime Miami police officer. Officer Paulino was working a night shift. So around 1 p.m. on August 21st, 2020, her husband was asleep in bed, so Paulino went out to his police car and was attempting to get something, but it's unclear what she was attempting to get. And when she climbed into the back seat, somehow the door closed behind her. I don't know if you've ever been in the back of a police car, but because arrestees always try and escape, they have mechanisms not allowing anybody to get out of the back seat, and it automatically locks from the inside. So Clara was completely trapped. And it was a blistering 95 degrees outside that day. Clara didn't have her cell phone either, and her husband was asleep. And the bar in a police car separating the back seat from the front seat was also locked. She could not reach through to honk the horn and alert anybody. So she sat in the back of this police car struggling to get out. She was banging on the windows, and they could tell she was because when they found her, she had bruises all on her wrists and hands. And they also found Clara's fingerprints all over the back seat, meaning she was touching every surface trying to figure out how to get out of this. And with the heat rising and her hyperventilating most likely, she may have also been losing oxygen. And sadly, hours later, around 5:30 p.m. that same day, her husband and her son found her dead in the back seat of the car. She had died from a heat stroke, and it's more than likely this death was very excruciating and long. It's almost as if Clara was literally cooked alive. And that's an awful situation I could honestly never imagine. Just imagine being that helpless in the back of the car when the heat is 95 degrees, and likely knowing I'm going to die from this. This is absolutely horrifying, and I also wonder who shut the door. Or how did it shut? Nonetheless, rest in peace to Clara.
This man went from a national hero to a national villain in just a day's time. This is Bernie Ward, a former talk show host from San Francisco, California. Bernie was for a long time the host of a daily news program called The Bernie Ward Show. He also hosted a 3-hour-long radio program on Sundays called God Talk. Bernie was a bleeding heart liberal. He preached about women's rights. He preached against homophobia. He tried to get the Catholic Church to come clean about their sexual abuse scandals. And over time, he raised $4 million for charity through an annual Thanksgiving event. Now, Bernie was actually so well loved by his community that when it was rumored that the station was going to cancel his show, Hundreds, thousands of people showed up to protest the show's cancellation, and they got him put back on air. But Bernie's star would dramatically burn out in the year 2007. You see, on September 20th, 2007, Bernie was indicted for 2 counts of attempting to distribute and 1 count of receiving CP or CSAM materials. The story goes like this. A dominatrix who worked online contacted the police after having some disturbing chats with Bernie. Apparently, he described to this online dominatrix in a chat room about how he had engaged in explicit activities with his own children, and he then sent her CP images through the chat. Now, when Bernie was arrested, he claimed that this was all innocent role-playing and that he was actually studying American culture for a new book he was writing. His attorney even insisted he was not in possession of CP materials, but that whole narrative changed soon after. Because when they checked Bernie's email account, they found over 100 images of CP or CSAM. He was then sentenced to only 6 years in prison, and he was released in the year 2014. That means that Bernie is still out there somewhere, able to access a computer, and only God knows what he's up to nowadays.
How do you get murdered in broad daylight in front of 20 people and no one saw a thing? Matt Flores was 26 years old, living in Silicon Valley. He had a beautiful wife, as you can see, Denise, and the pair had been married for 4 years. They'd recently had a baby, their daughter Danielle. On the 24th of March 1994, Matt had been just getting settled in at his new job. He drove to work that day just after 8 a.m. and parked his rental car outside. As he got out of his vehicle, he was shot dead. He was actually found deceased shortly after by a woman who'd been sitting in a car nearby. Now, despite there being a staggering 20 people around at the time of the murder, apparently nobody saw a thing. Now, Matt was a well-liked man in the local area. He wasn't involved in anything shady, and police were really stumped by who would have a motive for this sort of thing. Now, frustratingly and potentially intentionally, the murder happened in a CCTV blind spot. The CCTV did capture a 2-door Ford Explorer arriving 20 minutes prior to the killing. Just seconds later, a car similar to Matt's enters the car park. The Explorer followed it and then left the car park. The Explorer then comes back into the car park just seconds before Matt was killed. 20 seconds after Matt was shot, the Explorer exited the car park. Needless to say, police believe that the Explorer may have been stalking Matt that morning and following him. They think that it may have been a case of mistaken identity, and maybe they thought Matt was somebody else. Police were obviously hunting and still are hunting for the Explorer, which is believed to have been a model made between 91 and 94. It apparently has a distinctive black trim on its lower panels. Interestingly, Matt was previously in the military with Sergeant Nicholas Gange. Nicholas mysteriously vanished in April 1993 and wasn't seen for months. His body was later tragically found just a mile away from the military base. He was found with fractures in 7 ribs, 3 right ribs, a fractured sternum, and 6 fractured vertebrae, and his death remains unsolved, as does Matt's.
These are clips from disturbing movies you should never watch, part 1. The first movie in this series is gonna have to be The Strange Thing About the Johnsons. It's an extremely unsettling and disturbing short film on YouTube directed by Ari Aster. And if you know anything about this movie, you know just how disturbing and weird it is. The clip I'm about to show you from this movie is one of the most unsettling and disturbing scenes from it. I'm not going to spoil it in case some of you haven't seen it, but if you know, you know. Here it is.
It's gonna be okay. I'm just gonna come home a little bit later, okay? That's all.
A person who wakes up in the morning and says today's going to be awful, I just know it. Well, that person is just about guaranteed to have an awful day. In fact, he'll do the legwork to make it awful. Through the power of his attitude, he'll prevent every potentially good thing on his path from reaching its potential. And if good things do happen, well, he'll be looking in the other direction. Because what he's done is he's committed himself to the prison of negativity. Now, on the other side of this coin, a person who wakes up and greets the day with enthusiasm and positivity will see the good things on his path. Because through the power of
Dad? How do I feel about locked doors?
they appear, only you can determine the day. But it's true. The quality of your life is entirely dependent. If you decide that your life will be prosperous and filled with joy, then that is what it shall be. But know this,
93. Yes? Right.
I said 70 milligrams, people. Do I have to get on my hands and knees here?
I've only got 2 hands, doctor.
So use them. This poor bastard's gonna die on the splat. We don't work miracles and fast.
The right ventricle's dilated.
Suction! Quick!
I'm not even sure where to start with this one. This is a story of 3-year-old Sutton Mosser. It's pretty graphic, so viewer discretion is advised. Sutton lived with her mother Justine, her grandparents and her 2 uncles in Michigan and was the absolute centre of everybody's world. On September 14th, 2021, Sutton turned 3. 2 days later, her life ended in the most brutal way. Sutton had been left at home in her mother's care, somewhere she should have been perfectly safe. On September 16th, around 10 p.m, Sutton's uncle arrived home to an empty house. He didn't look for his sister or niece, but when his brother arrived home a few hours later and asked where they were, they decided to go and see if they were in the back room. What they found in that back room they could not have prepared themselves for. They saw a garbage bag with a foot sticking out. They decided to call their uncle, who arrived at the house, and then called the emergency services. Police and paramedics arrived and found 3-year-old Sutton wrapped in a comforter and stuffed inside a bin bag. She had stab wounds to her neck, chest and a gaping wound in her abdomen, exposing her intestines. She'd been stabbed a total of 17 times. There was a blood-stained pair of jeans in the bag with her, and bloody handprints on the bag and walls, as well as 3 knives recovered from the bedroom. One of the bloody handprints on the wall was found to be Sutton's. The rest were those of her mother Justine. Police located Justine at 8:30 a.m. on September 17th, walking along railroad tracks. She showed absolutely no emotion when the police told her that her daughter was dead, and she was arrested. Justine told police that she'd been having hallucinations, and it was cartoon character SpongeBob SquarePants that had told her to murder her daughter, or she'd be killed instead. She said she'd been abusing heroin and meth and was having withdrawal symptoms, causing hallucinations. She couldn't remember her daughter being left alone with her, or a single detail about murdering her. She had, however, had the mental capacity to change into clean clothes after murdering her daughter. She pleaded guilty to first-degree felony murder and first-degree child abuse, saying that if it was her that killed her daughter, she deserved to be punished. She was given a life sentence without the possibility of parole, plus 50 years for the child abuse charge. She'll spend the rest of her life in prison.
This teenager vanished. Her mum realised a clue may lie in something unsettling that happened the day before. Molly Bish was a 16-year-old girl from Michigan. She lived in Warren, Massachusetts, and in 2000 she got a job as a lifeguard at a local pond. On the 27th of June, her mum drove her to work. Just before 10 a.m, they stopped off at the local police station to collect Molly's radio, which was a normal thing that they did. Her mum then went to the pond and dropped Molly off. Just minutes later, a member of the public arrived at the pond with her children. She saw Molly's first aid kit was open and a backpack was alone on the bench, but no Molly. Molly's belongings were dotted around the area. There was no sign of a struggle, but Molly was nowhere to be seen. Molly's boss showed up an hour afterwards and realised there was no lifeguard there, so they actually reported her missing at 11:44 a.m. They knew it was completely out of character for Molly to just vanish. At around 1 p.m, Molly's mum was alerted. Now, unsettlingly, Molly's sandals had actually been left behind. Now, police started a huge search and scoured miles and miles of the local area with hundreds of police officers. It started to dawn on Molly's family that something sinister might have happened. Now, the search for Molly was actually the largest search in Massachusetts history. It then dawned on Molly's mum that something strange had happened the day before. Now, the day prior, as normal, Molly's mum had taken Molly to work. As they drove into the car park, they noticed a man sat in a car smoking. He seemed to be just loitering around the area and didn't seem to want to leave. Molly's mum said she was immediately unsettled by this man and tried to stare him out, but he actually just stared back at her. Obviously, Molly's mum wasn't really happy to just drive away and leave Molly there with the guy, so she actually waited in the car until the man left 20 minutes later. Following Molly's disappearance, her mum actually reported this to police and they made a police sketch of him. Frustratingly though, no one came forward. An ear witness also reportedly heard a scream at around 10 a.m. the day of Molly's disappearance. The case went cold until 2003 when a swimming costume was found in the woods. More than 20 human bones were also found nearby and they were identified as Molly via DNA. Now, although Molly was obviously finally able to be put to rest, Molly's case is actually still unsolved and her killer is still out there.
When this woman left her abusive husband, he punished her in the worst way possible. Claire Throssell was just 25 when she met Darren Sykes, and she was absolutely smitten with him. He was the perfect partner at first, but 3 years into their relationship, something changed and he became extremely abusive. She endured 2 decades of this abuse before finally fleeing with her 2 sons to her mum's house. Darren then began stalking Claire and sending abusive messages and threats to her and her family. Claire reported this abuse to police, as well as the abuse that she'd suffered for over 20 years, and she applied for a court order to prevent Darren from seeing their sons, Jack and Paul. But this was denied, and a judge actually ruled that Darren could have a 5-hour unsupervised visit every week with his 2 sons. This decision proved fatal, and Darren decided to punish Claire by doing the unthinkable. During one of these visits, Darren told his 2 sons that he had a surprise for them, but it was up in the attic. When they got up there, he barricaded the door, and he then set 16 separate fires in the house. He then barricaded himself inside too, while the flames engulfed him. Claire was just sitting down after a day at work when the police knocked on her door and said, "There's been a fire, you need to come with us now." They'd managed to rescue the boys that were still barely alive, and 12-year-old Jack managed to tell the firemen that it was his dad that had set the fire and that he'd done it on purpose. Claire urged 9-year-old Paul to wake up, and she said that she was looking into his beautiful blue eyes and he was looking back at her. His eyes then turned a horrible grey colour and he passed away. 12-year-old Jack was also in a really bad way. He'd suffered burns to 56% of his body while he was trying to pull his unconscious little brother to safety after they'd been engulfed with smoke in the attic. Claire spent 5 days by Jack's bedside before letting him go, while she said, "I love you, take my love with you and take my soul. Be safe." Claire says Darren killed the boys to make her suffer. Their lives were sacrificed for the ultimate punishment. Darren couldn't even face up to what he'd done to the boys, as he too died in the fire.
A woman found a mysterious briefcase at her front door. Moments later, it would kill her and her family. This case is absolutely full of twists and turns. It was November 1985 in Texas. The Blount family were enjoying their Thanksgiving when an unexpected tragedy would occur. The family members in attendance included the dad Joe, the wife Susan, and the daughter Angela and the cousin Mike. Now, as I said, the family had had a lovely Thanksgiving, and at around 9 p.m. that evening, Joe, Angela and Mike headed out to the shops in the car along with another family member. Susan decided to just have a lie down. She'd had obviously quite a full-on day, so she was just having a rest when she heard a knock at the door. She initially went to the door to see who it was, but couldn't see anybody, so she went and lay back down. When the family members returned from the shops, they noticed a briefcase at the front door. They took it inside, presuming someone may have just left it behind. When Angela opened it inside of the home, there was a huge explosion. Joe, Angela and Mike were killed instantly by the blast. Police arrived to the home, which, as you can see, was in an absolutely shocking state. Police started questioning neighbours, and one of the neighbours actually made quite a shocking revelation. He said he was actually involved in illegal weapons sales, and he believed that he could potentially have been the intended target. Frustratingly, there was a real lack of physical evidence in this case and no suspects, so the case went cold. That was until around 10 years later, when a prison inmate claimed that another inmate had confessed to the bombing. Michael Toney was in prison for a burglary. He'd been talking with fellow inmate Jack Ferris about the bombing. Jack told officers that Michael had actually confessed to the bombing to him. Now, Jack was actually released from prison because of this admission. Michael's wife was actually questioned about this, and at first she told them that there was no way that he could have done it, and then she changed her tune. She said she recalled seeing Mike with a briefcase. Michael was then charged with the bombing. Now, Jack later redacted his statement and said that him and Mike had come up with this plan together to help Jack get out of prison. Despite Jack admitting to this, Michael was still convicted of the triple murder and actually sentenced to death. Eventually, the conviction was overturned and it was revealed that 14 key pieces of evidence were withheld, which would have been key to his defence. In another twist in this case, he was released from prison in September 2009, finally thinking he was free to live his life, and tragically just 1 month later he was killed in a car accident. The triple murder case remains unsolved to this day.
If you've seen this website before, you're probably in prison. This is the message displayed on the now defunct Welcome to Video site. This site was the figurehead of an international CP production ring. And when it was shut down, it had 1.2 million members. Authorities also tracked down 360,000 downloads that stemmed from this website of CSAM or CP materials. 4,000 of these paid members were identified, and yes, they were all hardcore pedophiles. This guy was a local pastor who got caught downloading materials. And this guy, Nicholas Stengel from Washington, D.C., downloaded over 2,600 videos from the website. 2,686 to be exact. Videos depicting children being abused in the most horrific ways. By the way, this guy started a blog about wine that you can go online and read, and it's really disturbing reading his positive words knowing what he was doing in the shadows. So at the time that this website was seized, the owner had made over 400 million South Korean won, which equates to about $300,000 in USD. But who was the sick pedophile kingpin at the top of this hill? Well, it was this guy, Sun Jung-woo, whose identity in all the photos that have been released is purposefully obscured by the South Korean government. So Sun purchased this disgusting website in 2015 and ran it from his home. During his reign of terror, he distributed about 220,000 CP or CSAM videos. Users on the website could purchase these disgusting materials using Bitcoin, and Sun would often encourage people to upload their own content for fun. In a disturbing twist, 45% of the material that was found on the website had not been previously seen by investigators. In my math, that's over 100,000 videos and images. Now, this is the part that's going to really infuriate you. So, Sun Jung-woo, who ran this website, 220,000 videos and images that he personally cycled through to other pedophiles. After his trial, he was convicted and sentenced to a little bit over 2 years in prison. You heard that right, 2 whole years in prison for running a pedophile website with over 1 million members. The United States also tried to get him extradited to the US so he could face a number of charges and obviously get a life sentence. But the South Korean government denied this extradition request. Then, in July of 2022, he was sentenced to an additional 2 years in prison. This time for money laundering because he used some of his profits for online gambling. That means that sometime this year, this guy is going to be back on the streets. Now, keep in mind, this is mind-blowing. Less than 10 years ago, this guy was up and running one of the largest pedophile websites in the world. And already, less than a decade later, he's going to be walking free again. Please make some of this make sense. This should really infuriate you. I just am so afraid of what this guy could possibly do when he's back in the free world.
This woman rang her son to say that 2 suspicious men were outside her work. 10 minutes later, she vanished. This is the unsettling case of Trudy Darby. Trudy was 42 years old, living in Missouri. She worked as an assistant at a convenience store in Max Creek. On the 19th of January 1991, she rang her son at about 10 p.m. She was worried due to 2 strange men outside of her shop. She told her son that she was concerned and he decided to head over. Now, it only took him 10 minutes to get to the shop, but by the time he arrived, there was nobody there. Trudy's car, coat and bag, however, were still there. Worryingly, the till was open and $200 was missing. Trudy's son obviously began to worry that something really sinister may have taken place. Police were called and a search began for the missing mother. Tragically, just 2 days later, blood, hair and eventually Trudy's body were discovered. She was found near a road on the Little Niagara River. She had been hard and shot. Obviously, police set about trying to identify the 2 suspicious men that Trudy reported seeing before her death. Now, locals were questioned by police because due to the location of where Trudy's body was found, investigators had a hunch that the perpetrators were local. Frustratingly, no suspects were identified. That was until a shocking confession in 1993. A member of the public rang police to tell them that one of their friends had actually confessed to the crime. Jesse Rush and Marvin Shaney were actually half-brothers. They were local at the time of the murder. Now, Jesse had seemingly confessed to multiple people to committing the crime. Interestingly, they'd both been stopped in a car for speeding the night of the murder. Interestingly, they'd been stopped for speeding the night that the murder took place. The friend cooperated with police and decided to wear undercover recording equipment to capture the confession on tape. They succeeded and both men were arrested. It turned out both brothers had gone to the shop to rob it and decided to abduct Trudy and forced her into the boot of their car. They arred her and shot her, but when they decided to take her body to dump it at the final location, they discovered that the victim was still alive. Horrifically, they then decided to shoot her again. Now, Marvin denied involvement and his wife initially supported his alibi. Later, she confessed that she lied to support his alibi because she was scared of him, understandably. Both men were convicted of murder and kidnap and sentenced to life in prison. Chillingly, in letters to another inmate, Jesse actually mentioned dumping 2 further bodies in remote locations, and they have never been discovered.
This woman survived one of the most brutal and disturbing attacks ever, and this is a massive trigger warning. On December 18th, 1994, Alison Botha was abducted near her home in South Africa. By the end of the night, she had been stabbed, raped, and disemboweled, but somehow she managed to live. After an ordinary night out with her friends, Alison Botha drove back to her apartment in Port Elizabeth, South Africa. But as soon as the 27-year-old parked her car, a man with a knife forced his way inside. The attacker ordered Alison to move onto a different seat, trapping her inside of her own vehicle. He then drove her car to pick up an accomplice, and it was immediately clear that the 2 men had sinister plans for her. Frans du Toit and Theuns Kruger told Alison Botha that they were going to have sex with her. They asked if she would fight them, and clearly trapped and terrified for her life, she said no. The 2 men, who had history of violence against women, both raped her, and they then soon determined to kill her as well. At first, they tried to suffocate her, but even though she lost consciousness, she clung on to life. Frustrated, Frans and Kruger took their brutality to the next level. They stabbed Alison at least 30 times in the abdomen, who later recalled that Frans specifically wanted to mutilate her reproductive organs, but somehow the attackers missed those specific parts of her body. When Alison's legs twitched, Frans and Kruger decided the job wasn't quite done yet. They then slit her throat 16 times. Apparently satisfied that they had killed her, Frans and Kruger drove away, saying nobody could survive this. But little did they know, Alison was still breathing, and in the distance she could see headlights streaking through the bushes. When Alison moved towards the headlights, she realized the full extent of her injuries. As she pulled herself up, her head started to fall backwards since she had nearly been decapitated. Meanwhile, she could feel something slimy protruding from her abdomen. It was her intestines. She had to use one hand to keep her organs from spilling out, and the other hand to literally hold her own head on her body. There, she collapsed along the white line. Even in her disoriented state, she knew that this was the only and best position to attract the attention of the motorist. Fortunately, Alison didn't have to wait long. A young veterinarian student named Tian Ellard, who was visiting Port Elizabeth on vacation, saw Alison lying in the middle of the road and stopped. He used his veterinary training to tuck Alison's exposed thyroid back into her body. Then he called emergency services for help. Alison Botha was then rushed to the hospital where doctors were stunned by her horrific wounds. One doctor even said that he never seen such severe injuries in his 16 years of practicing medicine. Alison was on the brink of death, but she managed to pull through, and she also remembered everything about her attackers. She was soon able to identify them from police pictures while she was still in the hospital. This led to the speedy arrest of the Ripper Rapists, as they were called in the press. This case is just absolutely crazy, and can you imagine getting almost beheaded and disemboweled and surviving? I give Alison so much respect because most people would have just given up and died. But she managed to survive despite being brutally attacked and injured. This is definitely one of the craziest cases, and thank God Alison survived.
However, coined the phrase, "You can't make this stuff up," might have known the story of real-life boogeyman, Albert Fish. A slight, elderly man with grey hair, no one suspected the kindly single father of being sadistic child murderer and cannibal.
Child in foster care grabbed a shovel, insisting on searching for his missing mum. The quest would end up solving a shocking murder mystery. Bonnie Haim was 24 years old from Jacksonville, Florida. On the 6th of January 1993, she vanished. At the time of her disappearance, she had a husband named Michael, and the pair shared a 3-year-old son, Aaron. Michael and Bonnie both actually worked for Michael's aunt, named Evan. The night she vanished, Bonnie got home around 7:30. She actually had plans with Ivan that night at around 8 p.m. but didn't show up, and she then ended up ringing Ivan at 8:30 p.m. She said she wouldn't be coming over, the pair had had an argument and she was really upset on the phone. The morning after, Michael rang someone from work and said that Bonnie had left the night before and that they both wouldn't be attending work that day. Worryingly, that morning, Bonnie's bag was found in a bin with her money, her credit cards, her ID, and Michael was told about this discovery and phoned police. People quickly actually noticed his lack of emotion, and he told police that she had left of her own accord the night prior at about 11 p.m. He stated that his mum had come to look after Aaron while he went out to look for Bonnie, but he was only gone for 45 minutes and came back and didn't report her missing to the police. Police started scouring the local area and made another worrying discovery. This time it was Bonnie's car. It was abandoned near to the airport, which was near to where her bag had been found. Interestingly, the driver's seat was pushed way further back than Bonnie would ordinarily have it. There was also a shoe print which was quite distinctive in the driver's seat of the car, and that was the same size and same type of shoe that Michael wore. Child psychologists started working with the couple's son, Aaron, and this was very telling. Aaron ended up drawing a picture of his mum being killed by Michael. Now, obviously, he was a very young child, but he did insinuate that he had been taken along with his dad to dispose of his mum's body. Ivan also told investigators that Michael was verbally abusive to Bonnie in the workplace, and she'd once even witnessed a really horrific incident where he had slammed her hand into a car door. Ivan was also aware that Bonnie wanted to divorce Michael. Now, frustratingly, Michael tried to discredit his son's accounts of what had happened, and justice was delayed. Aaron was placed into foster care and heartbreakingly actually spent years sleeping with a brick under his pillow because he was so afraid that he might be hurt. When Aaron was 6, he asked his foster parents if they could go and find his mum. They agreed and he grabbed a shovel. He was finally able to remember that Michael had thrown a shotgun out of the window of the car over a bridge. He then finally identified the exact bridge that this was thrown off. The gun was located in the water under the bridge and it matched another one of Michael's weapons. Now, a judge ordered Michael to pay Aaron for damages, and as part of this, Aaron received his childhood home. Obviously, Aaron grew up, and when he was renovating the property in 2014, a human skull fragment was discovered. It was finally identified as his mum's skull. In 2015, Michael was arrested and charged with her murder, and he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison.
This pedophile was so terrible that when he was released from prison, they actually put out a public safety warning, warning people to stay away from this guy. This is James Alfred Cooper, who Canadian officials nicknamed the worst pedophile in Canadian history. So back in 1903, James was convicted of the brutal essays and torture of 6 children in Canada. And apparently he had used a number of torture devices to keep these kids from talking. He had used a cat o' nine tails, a cow whip, a cattle prod, belts, and sticks. 6 victims, they all went through so much, and this guy was responsible for all of it. James's background is shrouded in mystery. Nobody knows too much about what he went through as a kid, but he was convicted of assault when he was 22 years old back in 1958, and years later, his criminal career started out with burglary. So at first, when he would break into houses, he would just steal things for the thrill of it. He would take family photos, he would take fridge magnets, items from the kitchen. But that evolved into him wanting to wake up the people that he was robbing. He would stand over these people's beds, wake them up violently in the middle of the night, and then escape out of a window or through the door that he broke in through. But that evolved into a desire to SA people inside of their own homes. At one point, he SA'd a minor in their own home at knife point after waking them up in the middle of the night. He also did the same thing to a single mother while holding her at knife point. This guy was terrible, and it would only get worse. At one point, though, he married a woman named Patricia, who already had 3 kids. He would eventually have another child with her, and this is when the abuse of children began. And this is when the abuse really started. He would use these horrific tools to actually torture and abuse the children that were living under his own roof. And he did these mind games with the kids. He even made them eat things like their own excrement out of their pants while everybody in the house watched. This guy was sick and twisted. There's so much to the story that is so graphic and disturbing that I cannot talk about it here on TikTok. If you want to look it up, there's a great article online that explains this whole case, and it's just really hard to get through. But he would even do things like buy tubs of ice cream, rub it on his body, and make his children lick it off of him. He even at one point invited a neighborhood girl over with one of his own children, and he essayed both of them. Keep in mind, this whole time he was also physically abusing the children, beating them, he was verbally abusing them. He was just the worst person. I can't even get that across, how bad of a guy this dude was. Eventually, though, in 1987, he finally was arrested and charged with doing all of these horrible things. Eventually, DNA would link him to some of the break-ins that he had committed as well, and the assaults that he had committed during those break-ins. And at the time, he was given a 30-year sentence. Now, that doesn't sound like very much, but in Canada, that was the longest sentence ever given in Canadian history for crimes like this. But unfortunately, with Canada's laws, this meant that he didn't have to serve that much time for what he had done to his own children, to all of these kids for so many years, to all the random people he had victimized during the break-ins. And in 2012, he was allowed to walk free from prison after only serving 21 years. He was paroled out. And that's what led the Toronto Police Department, like I said at the beginning, to release a public safety warning, warning people that this guy was out of prison, he was walking amongst them, and that they didn't know what he was going to do next. So at the end of the day, if his sentences would have been imposed consecutively instead of concurrently, he would have been in prison for 180 years, meaning he would have died in prison. But since they don't do that in Canada, he only ended up serving those 21 years. Now, there is a little silver lining. Shortly after his release, he was re-arrested for breaking the terms of his parole. And at the time, he was on chemical castration drugs. He was actually urging his doctor to give him less of them. But since he was a first-time offender, as they called him back in '93 when he was sentenced, he was released shortly after violating the terms of his parole, and once again, he is somewhere out in Canadian society doing God knows what. I just thought I should make this TikTok to let you guys know that he is out there, and he's dangerous. He is a terrible human being. I'm urging you, if you want to read more about this case, to look up the news article. It is one of the most disgusting things I've ever read, and yeah, this guy is really worst of the worst. I can't think of a worse individual than this guy.
This is said to be one of the worst cartel videos ever, so whatever you do, don't look up the video. Before I begin, I can't stress enough how bad this video is. Whatever you do, never go searching for it. The full version of the video is 6 minutes long, and the video is shot in the nighttime in some sort of desert location. You see the victim, who has been blindfolded with his hands tied behind his back, and he is also wearing a white t-shirt that spells out the cartel he belongs to. The scene seems to be lit up by the car lights, and the victim is surrounded by multiple heavily armed cartel members. They are wearing all black tactical gear and carrying high-grade weapons. One of the cartel members then begins to read a statement, and as he's doing this, the cameraman starts to move closer to the victim. After the statement is finished, the victim is forced to the ground face down in the dirt. Multiple cartel members hold him down by stepping on his back and pulling back his arms. The victim has been completely immobilized so they can carry out this awful act of violence. The victim doesn't make a sound as he awaits what's about to happen to him. After the victim has been restrained and pinned down, a cartel member carrying some kind of large knife slices a vertical cut on the back of the victim's head. He does this as a starting point to flay and scalp the victim as he is still alive. After the cut, blood starts to puddle on the dirt floor, and using the initial cut, the cartel member slices under the victim's scalp and starts to remove it from the skull. As he cuts, he pulls the skin back to ease the blade cutting underneath the scalp. After a few seconds, the back of the victim's head has been completely scalped. However, the cartel member makes sure not to cut the skin off in chunks and instead attempts to complete the scalping and flaying in one clean go. After the skin on the back of the victim's head has been severed, the cartel member then moves to removing the skin and hair from the sides of the victim's head. While doing this, he also cuts off the victim's ears. The back of the victim's skull looks like a red ball with shades of white from the victim's skull also showing. The top of the victim's head is then scalped. The victim is still alive, but somehow has yet to make a sound. Not even one scream. The victim is then turned over on his back, and as this is happening, a cartel member puts his boot on his chest to stop him from moving, and at this point, the victim, who is still conscious, says his first words, and despite the awful and intense pain he must have been going through, he tells the cartel member to simply stop stepping on his chest in a very calm manner. But as he's lying on his back, a cartel member then flays the skin off of his face. He pulls the skin that has already been flayed and starts to cut down from the victim's forehead. And as the blade slices under the skin, you hear a tearing type sound, which is just awful. After about 20 seconds, the cartel member completes the flaying, but he realizes he missed a few pieces of skin on the victim's cheek. He then goes back and cuts the remaining skin off. The victim also has his nose cut off, and what is left of the victim is a horrific sight. His head looks like a red skull, and due to the lack of skin, it makes his teeth and eyes way more prominent. The detached scalp and face is then placed on the victim's chest, and the cartel member then finishes off the victim by cutting deep into his throat, and it appears to finally kill the victim. The cartel member then cuts off his tongue and takes off his shirt. He then plunges the knife deep into the victim's chest and cuts vertically, exposing all of his organs. The victim at this point has lost so much blood that it doesn't even cause bleeding. The cartel member then reaches into the victim's chest and cuts out his heart. The heart is still beating, and he then holds it up to the camera. The cartel member then kneels down next to the deceased victim as the camera focuses on the still beating heart. The last 2 minutes of the video is the cartel member still holding the beating heart in complete silence. Nobody talks, and all you hear is the wind blowing until the heart stops beating and the video concludes. Whatever you do, please don't go searching for this video. Just when you think you've seen it all, a video like this surfaces. I can't stress enough how bad this video actually is. It's just crazy knowing that this is happening in real time to real people, and it's just awful knowing that stuff like this happens on a daily basis.
Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. The case of Richard Trenton Chase is a story which even the most depraved horror writer would struggle to create. Over the course of 4 weeks spanning across 1977 and 1978, Richard Chase took the lives of 6 innocent victims in Sacramento, California. His murders gradually progressed in violence, beginning with drive-by shootings and culminating in acts of cannibalism.
3 different family members took their own lives inside of this house decades apart from each other. And that's why people think this might be the most haunted house in America. Welcome to the Lemp Mansion in St. Louis, Missouri. The story of this house is incredibly disturbing, filled with tragedy and sadness, and it's one of the most interesting stories behind a haunted house that I've ever learned about. So this is William Lemp Sr. He came to St. Louis and took over the operations of the Western Brewery. He grew the brewery to a massive proportion and renamed it the Lemp Brewery. The Lemp Mansion itself was built over a network of underground caves that was used by the brewers. And if you know anything about St. Louis, Missouri, the place is a brewery town. It's the birthplace of Anheuser-Busch, who produces Bud Light, Budweiser. And for years, the Lemp Brewery, which was owned and operated by the Lemp family who lived here in the Lemp Mansion, was the biggest brewery in St. Louis. But as time went on, William Lemp Sr.'s health began to decline. His youngest son, Frederick Lemp, died suddenly and tragically from a heart condition. And soon afterwards, William Lemp Sr. headed upstairs in the Lemp Mansion, took out a pistol, and took his own life inside of the house. William was only the first of 3 men from the Lemp family who would take their own lives inside of the home in the same manner. So after William Lemp Sr. took his own life in the mansion, William Lemp Jr., aka Billy Lemp, took over the entire brewing operation. But just years after taking the reins of the business, the Prohibition era started. When was a time in America, if you don't remember, when alcohol was completely illegal. This caused the brewery to shut down and shattered Billy's dreams. Just a few years later, in what is now the front left dining room of the building in Billy's old office, Billy took a pistol and ended his own life, just like his dad had done in the same house years prior. This was all shocking already, a father and son taking their own lives in the same house in the same manner a decade or so apart from each other. And already the Lemp Mansion began to take on a haunted reputation. People who visited the mansion, even in that time period, claimed that they saw the spirits of Billy and William floating throughout the home. They didn't know what they wanted, but they wanted something. And let me tell you, the interior of this house is exactly like you would expect it would look. It is very creepy, it is very haunted looking, and it just looks like a place where you would see a ghost. We can't move on in the story without mentioning Elsa Lemp, Billy Lemp's sister. Now, Elsa was the daughter of William Lemp Sr., who, if you'll remember, took his own life with a pistol, and the sister of Billy Lemp, who also took his own life with a pistol. Well, 2 years before Billy took his own life, Elsa also took her own life with a pistol. But she just didn't do it inside of the Lemp Mansion. She did it in her own home. People still don't know if she actually took her own life or if she was murdered, but it was another tragedy that struck the Lemp family. Now, with the brewery being shuttered, with 3 Lemps having taken their own lives, the Lemp family seemed to be cursed. And locals in St. Louis began to speak of a Lemp family curse. But after Elsa and Billy Lemp's tragic deaths, it seemed like the curse had been broken. But years later, that tragic curse would strike again. This is Charles Lemp, William Lemp Sr.'s 3rd son. Before the Lemp Brewery was shuttered, Charles Lemp had actually left the family business and went into the world of banking. He dabbled in politics, made a fortune, And he lived in the Lemp mansion with his dog and 2 servants. No, he never married, but he was a rich man who seemingly lived a happy life. But in the year 1949, 27 years after his own brother Billy Lemp had taken his own life in the Lemp mansion, Charles Lemp penned a note that said, "If I am found dead, blame it on nobody but myself." And he then took a pistol and took his own life in the same house. So if you're keeping track now, that is 3 members of the Lemp family who took their own lives with pistols inside of the Lemp mansion, and a daughter of the family who took her own life with a pistol in a different location. Now, obviously, this is a massive reason why people think that the Lemp family mansion is haunted. In fact, the Lemp mansion is routinely named as one of the most haunted houses in America. People see all of the members of the Lemp family floating throughout the home. They'll hear screaming, they'll hear echoing of gunshots, and oftentimes people just get really bad vibes inside of the house. And there's other history that haunts this home. There's the story of a young deformed boy that was forced to live in the attic, never to be seen by the public, who was beaten to death by one of his parents. And let me tell you, staying overnight in the mansion completely alone, I can tell you that this place is 100% haunted. When I stayed there, before we had even started ghost hunting, we heard the sounds of somebody screaming from the bottom floor of the home. In my video that I posted on YouTube, this is the very first minute of the video before we had even started filming. Like I said, we got out our iPhones and went to investigate and found that, yeah, there was nobody there. All the doors were locked. We were the only people in the mansion. And this ended up being such a freaky place that I couldn't even sleep with the door locked. I had to barricade my door shut with a chair. I know that sounds wimpy, but that's how scary it was. And that's how present the negative energy is inside of that historic mansion. So if you want to watch the full-length documentary that I filmed about the Lemp Mansion, it's on my YouTube channel, The Paranormal Files Now. We had full access to every single room in the house. We interviewed people that had worked there for years. And like I said, we slept there and spent the night ghost hunting. It is one of the scariest things I've ever done. And if you like spooky stuff, I highly recommend that you go check that video out.
This schoolboy stabbed his teacher to death in front of a classroom full of students. 61-year-old Anne Maguire was a Spanish teacher teaching in Leeds. She'd actually worked at the school for 40 years and she was only 5 months off retirement. However, in April 2014, something absolutely horrific happened. One of her students was 15-year-old Will Cornick. He'd always been described as a smart student who never really caused any trouble. Classmates regarded him as a polite student, but after he got diagnosed with diabetes, his personality seemed to change. In 2013, he tried to join the army, but because of his diagnosis, he was rejected. Being in the army had been his dream, so this was really upsetting for him. After failing to complete his Spanish homework, he was given detention by Anne. He also expressed a wish to her that he wanted to drop Spanish, but she wouldn't let him, which only angered him more. He began to develop a deep-rooted grudge against Anne. Shockingly, he reportedly messaged his friends on Facebook asking if one of them would kill her for him for £10. During one school day, halfway through his Spanish class, Will decided to get up and attack Anne with a knife. The classmates watched on in horror as he chased her out of the classroom. When there, another teacher heard her screams and tried to shield Anne from any more blows from him. Will then allegedly returned to his class and told his classmates how it was a shame that he hadn't killed her. However, Anne did actually pass away from her injuries. Will later admitted that he did plan also to kill 2 other teachers. One of them was actually pregnant at the time. He's been sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 20 years.
This guy is one of the most awful serial killers there has ever been, and I feel like he's never talked about. In my opinion, this guy's worse than Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer. Hi Meg, I talk about true crime. Let's get into the story of The Butcher, the worst serial killer Canada has ever seen. Robert Pickton was born October 24th, 1949, in British Columbia, Canada. Robert had quite a bad upbringing. His dad was very abusive. He actually grew up on a pig farm. From a really young age, him and his brother had to work countless hours on this pig farm, and then they were forced to go straight to school without taking a shower or anything. Because he was showing up to school unwashed, Robert started getting bullied, and they gave him the nickname Stinky Piggy. As Robert grew older, he was said to be very quiet, but he apparently sometimes had these weird bursts of bizarre behavior. These bursts would come out of nowhere and he would just start acting really strange. In 1996, Robert's brother opened up a kind of charity thing. The charity was started to try to make more money for their pig farm. It was called the Piggy Palace Good Times Society. And what they would do is they would hold huge parties and raves to try and raise money. And I'm not joking when I say huge parties and raves. 17,000 people were said to have shown up at one point. 17,000 people at once. Sex workers and biker gangs would join these parties as well. But for Robert, it all started going downhill in 1997 when he attempted to murder a girl. I don't usually do this in these videos, but a lot of you ask what blush I use, and this is the blush I use. It's usually £10 on the TikTok shop, but it's on for $5 right now. So if you click right here, you can get it. I just ordered kind of a peachy version of this. I'm not being paid to talk about this. I just saw they were on offer, and you guys ask about these all the time. So get your hands on them for cheap while you can. So Robert attempts to murder a woman for the first time that we know of. According to her statement, he attempted to handcuff her, and then he started stabbing her multiple times before she managed to get away. This should have been the thing that got him on police radar, but he was able to get the charges dropped because the woman he attacked was on a lot of drugs at the time, and Robert used that to come up with a story. He told police, like, she was hitchhiking, I was just trying to help her, and she attacked me. And they believed him because she was on drugs. And unfortunately, for the next 60 women he would kill, he was let go. And he was able to come up with a strategy that wouldn't get him caught next time. He developed a plan and started killing a bunch of women. And Robert was really, really good at staying under the radar. Now, what did he do exactly? Let me tell you. Because it's disturbing. First of all, he always went for hitchhikers, addicts, or prostitutes. And what he would do is he would promise them money, drugs, accommodation, anything to get them back to his farm. Once he got them back, he would then shoot or strangle them to death. And this next part is why he was given the name the Butcher. He would take the victims' bodies, chop them up, and feed them to his pigs. Now, if you're not aware of this already, pigs will literally eat anything. Everything. So the evidence was just, bye. They were getting rid of the evidence for him. All of a sudden, there is an increase in missing women in the area. But sadly, because he only went after sex workers or addicts or hitchhikers, no one cared. And this always makes me so mad with cases like these. Like, they're still human beings, but no bodies were showing up, so there was no crime, no body, no crime. But as the numbers started rising, people were kind of getting a bit worried. A group of people that weren't the police actually got a list together of all of the names of these young women who were missing. They brought that to the police and were like, do you see now? And that's when the investigation actually began into finding out what happened to these girls. And all of these girls had one person in common: Robert Pickton. He was the only person whose name continuously came up when they were looking for these girls. Police needed a way to get onto the farm with a warrant without him knowing about it and hiding all the evidence first. And so they heard that he had possession of an illegal firearm. And so they used that as the cover-up to get onto his property. On the property, they found multiple items that belonged to these missing women, along with some blood-stained clothing and tiny bone fragments. Now, things aren't looking too good for Robert, but because the pigs had eaten all the evidence, basically all of it, they were only able to charge him with the murder of 6 women. And so he got 6 counts of murder. When he got arrested, he actually said that he killed 49 women and that he was sad that he didn't get to round up to 50. What the hell, Robert? What does he want the police officer to say, like, oh, I feel so bad for you? No! He was arrested in 2002, and this trial was huge. Of course, he was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. But guys, that's not the worst part of this story, because I'm getting to that now. One element of the story that I kept out until now is that Robert sold the meat of his pigs to people who lived around the area. These pigs, who ate the remains of 60 women, were sold to his neighbors. When I say neighbors, I just mean people who live in the area. So like secondhand cannibalism. I could never eat pig again if that was me. So yeah, they were pretty disturbed and freaked out by this information, which is totally understandable and just totally disgusting. After a huge search of his property, police now believe that the number of women Robert killed was in the 60s. 60 women. 60 mother, daughters, wives. It's insane. It really annoys me with cases like these. I know it was like in 2002 and things have changed, but have they? I find that a lot of cases like these that I cover always start with, oh, all these women were going missing, but they were sex workers, but they were drug addicts. Who cares? And it's like, it's insane to me that like they're not seen as equals to any other woman walking on the street, but whatever. Hopefully that changes. And for those wondering, I have actually covered this story before, but the quality of the video was so bad that I couldn't keep it up anymore. Like, it really bothered me to watch back, so I thought I would remake it in a higher quality way. I hope you guys enjoyed it regardless, and have a wonderful day. My heart goes out to every single one of the victims, their families, and people who cared about them, and I hope Robert rots in jail. Anyways, this is not a good representation of Canadians. We're actually really nice people. I'll see you all in the next video. Love you guys. Bye.
This is the disturbing case of the child who killed a child. In July 2018, 6-year-old Alicia McPhail was abducted from her bed. She'd been staying with her grandparents in the Isle of Bute. She'd gone to sleep watching Peppa Pig, and no one had any idea of the horrors that would unfold that evening. Meanwhile, 16-year-old Aaron Campbell was drinking with friends at his house. Aaron apparently became upset in the night because he had been arguing with his mum. He had had a challenging upbringing involving physical and emotional abuse. Aaron decided that evening he wanted to get some substances to smoke from a couple that he knew. The couple in question were Alicia's dad Robert and his girlfriend. They'd been known to sell substances to Aaron previously, but he could not get hold of them. Intending to go and steal them off them, Aaron armed himself with a knife. He headed to Robert's house where he lived with his parents and girlfriend. This was obviously where Alicia was staying that evening. When he arrived at the house, he noticed the 6-year-old sleeping in her bed and took the opportunity to snatch the poor defenseless young child. Disgustingly, he carried her to a secluded location, SA'd her and then killed her. He then disposed of his clothes in the sea. At 6 a.m. the next day, Alicia's grandparents woke up to discover that the little girl was missing. They straight away alerted police and locals. When the family asked Aaron to keep an eye out for the little girl, he texted them back saying, "Oh damn, I'm sure she's not went too far." A local man soon discovered Alicia's lifeless body around 15 minutes away from her house. Along with a lot of the local community, Aaron's mum actually checked her CCTV of her house. She was hoping that this would help with the investigation, and it definitely did. She saw her son leaving and returning from the house that night, and she handed the evidence over to police. Aaron was arrested, and it was discovered that the clothes that he'd abandoned on the beach did actually match with his DNA.